Welcome to the Red Ink Revival Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Norris. We're going to grow your leadership through neuroscience, psychology, and theology. We are in a global pandemic. We're leading through a global crisis. How do we make sense of it all? How will we lead our organizations when the Rona is kicking anxiety into increasingly higher gears? What's fear? What is it? When is anxiety healthy and when does it become dysfunctional? How does the body metabolize fear? How can we lead our teams through this emotional side of the Rona pandemic? Hey everybody, welcome to episode number 15 of the Red Ink Revival Leadership Podcast. My name is Patrick Norris, and our goal today is to help you lead with a whole heart, a healthy brain, and a soul on fire. I'm so glad you're with us. Today's conversation in episode number 15 is with my friend Dr. Todd Bowman. Dr. Bowman's a psychologist and neuroscientist and just an overall amazing human being. I'm so glad to have you with us wherever you get your podcast or in the video version on YouTube. We drop content new every week, shooting for the Thursdays of each month. If this podcast is adding value to your leadership in life, I really ask you to subscribe to it, like it, comment in the reviews, and then a big help would be if you would share it on your social media platforms. Today's episode is brought to you in partnership with River Valley Conference. River Valley Conference is an amazing pastor and church leader conference. I landed at one of their one-day events in Kansas City, and it was just amazing. Our whole Red Ink team is going to be hosting a breakout on June 8th and 9th. If you go to rivervalleyconference.com, you can register. Use the code REDINK, one word, to get $10 off. I hope to see you there. Let's go now to this week's episode number 15 with my good friend, Dr. Todd Bowman, as we talk about the Rona pandemic and fear. Well, Todd, welcome. Today we're going to talk about the Rona fear, the novel coronavirus. Of course, we're in the middle of a lot of crazy stuff.
Yeah.
A global crisis and a lot of talk around anxiety and fear, and I wanted to tee all that up. How you doing, man?
I'm doing well. Just got done with 14 days of quarantine. We were in London when all this happened, and the first flight back we could get wasn't until after the midnight cutoff on the 16th of March. So,
and by we were in London, you're not talking about we like you and your wife. You're talking family, friends. You had a crew. In fact, if I have it right, you were about to get on the plane or just had been 10 minutes on the plane when the news came of the global shutdown.
Yeah, and at the time the UK wasn't a part of that, but then within a few days, and we worked hard to enjoy our time there while we're, on the other hand, trying to make flight arrangements and shut down the rest of our trip and get back home. So it's interesting perspective, right? Like I wasn't here for Charmin-Palooza when everybody ran out and grabbed the biggest toilet paper roll or package they could find. But Patrick, there's some interesting social psychology behind that.
Let's talk about it.
So one of the findings here in making sense of that is in times of panic, in times of pandemic, we look for ways to ground ourselves, to feel like we're doing something. And these social psychologists, you got to forgive me for forgetting the authors' names right now, they found that the reason it was toilet paper, because that's the biggest thing that most people could successfully go to the store and purchase and get in their car and carry home, had nothing to do with the function of the toilet paper.
Wow.
Had everything to do with the size of the package and the belief that the bigger the package, the more secure we are, and the more we dampen our fears or lessen our fears if we have something big that we can hold. Now, you got to remember, I'm in London looking at the news and watching Facebook blow up. There's no toilet paper anywhere. Pictures of Walmart and Hy-Vee and Price Chopper. No one has toilet paper, and I'm sitting there thinking, like, this is fascinating psychologically.
Well, in England, did they have plenty of toilet paper, or was it just a phenomenon?
Yeah, we were there in this window, right? Like, it was life as usual for most people over there.
Yeah.
And I'm looking at things back home. Now, eventually, right, like we got out on the 17th, and then kind of there's the panic hits, and every country's dealing with this kind of in a different way. And they had some of the shortage of resources. including toilet paper, apparently. Toilet roll over there is what it's called. Just
a toilet roll. Well,
yeah.
we don't want to offend
Yeah, we don't want to offend anybody. For our Brit friends across the pond, toilet roll as well. But it's fascinating, right? Like as I'm sitting across the pond, watching this all happen, reading these articles around like it's the size of what we're trying to reach for and can hold, right? Like my mind goes right to the bigness of God. Yeah. Like of course we reach for something big in times of panic, in times of distress, in times of the unknown. Like that's what we're created for. Like our faith intrinsically leaves us longing to reach out for something big to hold on to.
Wow.
And unfortunately, we're not going to find much help in the context of a ginormous package of 48 count Charmin Huggy Bear, right? Like that's not the bigness that we're really created to reach for. So it's interesting, just as a psychologist, to watch us navigate this space. When intrinsically we're reaching for something, like we're driven to reach for something.
Well, it's the survival circuits, right?
Absolutely.
That are saying, I need power to at least give me the illusion of control. And grabbing for a big 48 pack of toilet paper feels like I can't do most things. I can't control the global crisis, but I can control this, which really is so common among many of the behaviors that we do every day and don't even dig down into it. I just think it's wild. We're going to talk about fear today. And we want to, first of all, think of what is good fear and what is maybe not good fear. And the way I frame it up, and I'd love to hear your perspective as well, but the way I frame up the origins of fear is that, of course, in the Garden of Eden, there was no need for fear. There wasn't anything that was a threat. But at the point in which there was an injury of sin, that Adam and Eve sinned, the very first expression that they give is that, God, we hid ourselves because we were afraid. They were afraid. So there was fear driving them to hide. It seems as though that God in his goodness, like he does in everything, he takes something that is evil or fallen and he turns it around for something good. And so that fear that started as kind of an evil reaction to sin then became a redemptive part of our humanity in a fallen world to help us to survive. So let's talk about the good, and let's talk about, after that, eventually into what are the dysfunctions and the things that actually take away the beauty of life as we live in these dysfunctional fears. So let's start with what is some good fear, and help us make sense of this stuff.
Yeah, happy to. What's interesting is that passage in Genesis, we also tend to tie back the origins of shame. Right there. They covered themselves and they hid, and kind of this covering and hiding dimension of shame. And we don't have time to delve into all this today, but just to plant a seed for future conversation for us. This relationship between shame and fear. And we're really infatuated with the construct of shame right now in the psychological community in the 21st century. Yeah. And I think we do a disservice to really fully understanding what shame is and the function it serves when we disconnect it from the soil of fear that it really emerges out of. And the idea that what if shame is a really unique interpersonal kind of fear, right? If it's true that shame is this experience of feeling, of appraising the self as deficient or defective in some way on the heels of a psychological disconnect with a primary attachment figure, which is how we would define shame clinically. Right, like, well, there's a fear element beneath that, and we have to look at fear, I think, as the master emotion. From a neurological perspective, certainly from a biblical perspective, fear gets addressed quite a bit. So we'll double back, you and I, at some point to talk about kind of the interrelatedness between shame and fear, because that's a critical point. And as much as we do in Red Ink Revival with addressing shame in the context of the workshop, we also address a lot of fear. And I think it's important for us to be really explicit in having conversation around how shame and fear are tied together. Because it's true, like the neurobiology and truths from the Word really tell the same story.
Yeah.
And that's what I hope we can do some of in our time today.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
So your question was kind of what's this kind of healthier, redemptive side of fear?
Yeah.
I tend to start from the position that God designed our bodies beautifully, perfectly with regard to their function. And fear, sometimes theologically, we do interesting things with fear, right? Like, fear not. If you're afraid, you have no faith. Yeah. Well, like, I don't know.
Right.
Like, I don't know about that, because when we think of fear, not on a theological level, not even on an emotional level, but from an embodied physiological perspective, your point is well made. Like, the function of our fear is really about survival. It's about navigating the inevitability of threat in a fallen world.
Yeah. Yes. Yes.
And we can't walk through the world without our bodies, and even if in our minds and in our spirits we try and calm that, like, our bodies are designed with a very specific function, which is to appraise that threat and then determine, is this threat realistic or is this something that right, I make up my head. A case in point, in the Garden of Eden, they didn't have to worry about like what was happening in their 401k or their 403b.
Yep.
Right? Like, there wasn't this sense of worry in the same way, because there wasn't the same idea of a projected future.
Yes. Yes.
Right, and so much of when we look at the Old Testament, the New Testament, some of the difference in fear, anxiety, worry that we see then is just different, because now we have more perceived threats that exist to us, and we can project into the future. Even something like extending the lifespan awakens more opportunity for fear for us, because there's more extended future for us to cast our imaginations into.
Yeah.
Right? So worry is really a much bigger part of the idea of anxiety that I think we're seeing and have to be navigating right now. Not to discount the reality. I mean, there's millions of physicians, anesthesiologists, nurse practitioners, nurses, med techs. People are on the front lines every day. Yeah. That fear, that anxiety is very real, because they are in constant contact with the reality of the threat of coronavirus and COVID. Whereas the vast majority of us, if we're sheltering in place, if we're doing all the social distancing that we're supposed to do 6 feet apart like we are, the idea is, right, like that the worry is the bigger part of our anxiety, right, rather than the actual legitimacy of the threat. Now, there are places where the threat is very real, obviously outside the medical community as well, but it's those folks who are caring for people who are suffering from this really communicable disease. It's a really ugly, nasty virus, and tends to target those who have some degree of underlying illness or susceptibility with their lung functioning. It just is an ugly, nasty virus. And for the vast majority of us, this worry piece about the future is going to be a bigger part of the anxiety that we need to navigate, rather than the actual threat. It's the perceived threat for the majority of us, rather than the actual exposure threat that might exist.
You know, we live in a world today where we want information in short, portable, handled kind of packages, 140 characters. I want to have the answers that I can repeat, put on social media, all that kind of stuff. And what you're saying is well, that's a little more complex than that, because we use terms that are often generalized, and therefore we put everything in one big category, like anxiety or fear. Right. And within, as you said, the Christian community, a lot of times we make it black and white, absolute, just fear not. And truly, a lot of people, I think, have taken the fear nots of Scripture and made it into a corrective rebuke. Fear not, you idiot. Fear not, stupid. Fear not. And yet, when you look at even the neurobiology, you know that what calms the fear circuits is empathy and compassion. And so it appears to me that when God shows up to tell somebody to fear not, when Jesus approaches somebody and says, fear not, or when you have an angel who's carrying the message, fear not, all of those are embodying, they're enveloping empathy and compassion, identifying, hey, I see you're in fear. And now then I'm going to give the energy that is nonverbal, that you now are seen, you're felt, you're heard. And the empathy is what is beginning to reprocess that loop of fear that is shutting people down. And that really it's not a rebuke, it's really an invitation into being known and felt.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it this way, it's connective. Those rebukes need to be connective before they're corrective.
that's so good.
Right? Like there's no adequate correction in that until there is some sense of joining, sense of attuning, sense of connecting.
Yes.
That needs to happen. And I think to your point, like biblically, that's what we see.
Yeah.
Right? Like that if it's an angel coming, right? Like fear not. Like you're not alone.
Yes, you're not alone.
Right? Like so don't be afraid because we're connected. Like God is present with you. Which gives me goosebumps, right? Like now all of a sudden the idea of Emmanuel, God being with us, takes on a whole different function, especially in the midst of a present crisis. But I think that's where so many of us find ourselves struggling and suffering is it's hard with a 6-foot social distancing rule to really feel felt.
Yeah.
Right? Like we're embodied creatures. We're given this physical vessel for a reason, even though it's not quite as trustworthy. What we see, what we hear, what we taste, what we touch, like that's not the fullness of our design. But yet in these physical vessels we inhabit, like that's part of how we ground ourselves. It's part of how we find comfort in the midst of, it's how we connect. Right, in the midst of intense fear and anxiety. And when we can't do that, I think that's a big piece of why worry is permeating our imaginations right now, is because this instinctive thing that we're created to do, because that's there in the garden too. Right, like connect. It's not good for man to be connect. Created for connection. We have social neurobiology. That's what's being interrupted. And I think that's why fear, anxiety, phobias, paranoia, some traumatic intensification for folks who are dealing with PTSD or stress-related disorders are feeling that because we can't move in this space of really intuitive physical grounding by holding hands, by hugging, by sharing a meal, by sitting close, by snuggling up and watching a show. Maybe within the family some of that's happening, but like it's not happening in the breadth that we typically find it happening. And especially for the church, right? Like as a body of believers, like the inability for us to come together. We meet digitally, we meet online, we sing worship songs, and again, that's great for family units, but hey, not everybody's in a family unit. You've got folks who are perhaps living alone, folks who maybe have roommates, but are trying to navigate this space of how do we keep ourselves healthy if roommates are going home, like how do we not have the second and third level infection? I mean, there's just so many dimensions to this that none of us expected that load on our anxiety. And you made a great point about, my mind just kind of lit up when you were talking about how much we desire in our tablets and our phones this information. And my mind went right to, there's bigness there too. It's not like the 48 pack of Charmin that you can load in your trunk and feel grounded and secure. But I think a lot of us go to look for information. And it's a really unique kind of torture when the information that we seek out to assuage our fears and ground our anxieties is the thing that's actually fueling the intensification of the fire. And I think that's where most Americans are right now, because we don't have good scientific information about this. I mean, we're on the front end of this. It's just not, it's been a pandemic for 2 weeks now, I think designated, maybe less than that. And here we are with not a lot of good science to really affirm, right? Like, and maybe that's, there's criticism in that, well, Todd, you're too much of a science person, you need to be a faith person. Like, trust me, like I'm a faith person. And I think that the sciences do a fantastic job of helping us just understand what is happening in this world that we're inhabiting.
So
I don't put my faith in science, but I think we have to have good science and good information for us to really understand.
Romans chapter 1 tells us that when we look at science, we understand God. That doesn't mean it's the highest revelation. Our highest revelation is Scripture. But we love being able to get into the minute details of how things work, that science shows us God is a God that does things in a measurable, observable, predictable, repeatable kind of way. And so, I'm with you. Well, I want to hit back on the good fear for a little bit. Because again, within the Christian circles, it's just fear not, fear not, fear not. Absolute, you should never have anxiety, you should never have fear. And I just want to reaffirm that there is a divine wiring within us that when you are living in healthy anxiety, anxiety is actually the warning light, like on your car. It's a warning light to tune into your feelings. It's telling you something about your feelings. Your inner world needs attention. And a lot of us, anytime you have anxiety, we move out of the window of tolerance. We're not really allowing ourselves to lean into it, to be informed by it. We run from it, we repress it, and then it, with an energy, burst up and out. But anxiety, in its fundamental good, is that it compels us to look for solutions. Otherwise, we would just be stuck in every situation that's coming in our lives. But anxiety allows us to rise up, to face whatever it is, and to say, it's not okay, I'm going to innovate, I'm going to be an entrepreneur, I'm going to look for new out-of-the-box ideas that can help me. That's the good of anxiety. But somewhere between that good and then moving into the dysfunction, the disorders, is this idea that somehow the solutions I have available to me are actually addressing the real problem. So we end up spinning with solutions that aren't actually effective, and we're living in that illusion that if I can control the moment, if I speed up, if I can binge, if I can, do something I have choice power in, like toilet paper, then I'm going to be okay. So let's talk about maybe where that line is between a good, healthy human experience of innovation, something that promotes us, energizes us to think of a different way of doing life, that's good and godly, that moves into this fear of now I'm a victim, now I'm powerless, now right on down the line. Where's that line?
Yeah, kind of two terms I would introduce for us to think about this with is eustress and distress. Eustress mean E-U-D-I-S-T-R-E-S-S, eustress, right? E-U-S-T-R-E-S-S, eudistress, eustress. And distress. Eustress is exactly that. It's this sense of energy that is awakened in us to overcome the hurdles and obstacles that could awaken anxiety, right? So it's a stress response. Right? Think about running. I see a lot of people running these days because they have some extra time. I'm one of those people that with the extra time I've been afforded, trying to lean more into physical fitness and wellness and taking care of my body. Like running that first mile, let me tell you, it was stressful to my body. Like it exerted a toll and demanded energy. And the outcome of that is going to be an increase in function, cardiovascular health, musculoskeletal health, pulmonary health. Like my body is straining and stressing, but towards some positive outcome. Okay. Versus distress, which would be where that straining, spinning our wheels would be another way of looking at this, staying stuck. That's where we see so much distress. And when we look diagnostically speaking, that's where we see a lot of these hallmark features of anxiety-related disorders that are really about doing the same thing over and over, but it's not gaining us the relief, it's not gaining us the sense of security that we're looking for. Just a quick kind of look at these different disorders and maybe some of their hallmark features where we get stuck.
Love it.
I think about generalized anxiety disorder, really that pervasive sense of worry. Right, and we haven't talked about anxiety as maybe an umbrella, and there's fear, meaning this kind of physical reaction to a present threat or an appraised, perceived threat.
Yes.
Versus kind of this idea of worry. Right, worry very much an experience that's mostly cognitive, where we carry this concern about things that may happen but haven't yet happened, or if they have happened, this fear that they may happen again, even if there's not good indicators that they're going to happen again. Mm-hmm. But it's this attempt at how do I stay safe? If I worry enough, then I'll be safe. But it doesn't work that way. Then our bodies are carrying this toll, absolutely, of distress, of if I'm worrying that much, I'm going to always be finding something new to worry about, and I'm not actually more secure, I'm more worried.
Yes.
Right, so there's the distressing side of that. Does it make sense to worry? Yes, in the context of having food for the week, making sure that the budget's gonna last for the month. Those are stressful things that can awaken anxiety, and they can be eustressors, right? They can be things that actually help us navigate the current circumstance instead of this constant worrying, projecting things into the future.
Yeah.
Another look would be something like obsessive compulsive disorder, where the idea is these compulsive behaviors that I do, or these ruminative thoughts, counting, checking, things like that, are places where folks with OCD get stuck. OCD is an anxiety-related disorder. If I do these things enough, then the bad thing I'm afraid is going to happen will happen. Or I can stay safe, I can stay secure if I just do these things, which is kind of illusory, right? The obsessing thoughts, the compulsive behaviors don't actually serve that function. And that's really where OCD is kind of a vicious disorder, really treatment resistant in that the intensity, the embodied nature of those obsessions and compulsions is just a little bit greater than with something like generalized anxiety. A bit more difficult to root out because of the embodied dimension to that. But again, we see the same pattern of the anxiety is trying to be quelled by a symptom.
Yeah.
But it doesn't actually work that way. The symptoms actually exacerbate the idea of distress, which kind of perpetuates the need for the symptoms. And it's this really exhausting kind of treadmill of anxiety that folks find themselves stuck on, wanting to get off, thinking that what they're doing, either with worry and generalized anxiety or with ruminative obsessive thoughts or compulsive behaviors and OCD, right, are actually the things that speed up the treadmill.
Yeah.
And then I think about PTSD and trauma just as another kind of one of these classifications of concerns. So much of PTSD is about hypervigilance, startle response, kind of sleep impairment. I've always got to be prepared to respond to what was a very real threat.
Yep.
Right? Could have been the potential for a firefight or a home intruder or a car accident, whatever the very real threat was. Kind of the body gets stuck in anticipating and staying prepared for the next traumatic moment, even though that next traumatic moment may never happen.
Yeah.
So a lot of those symptoms, similarly, are really about survival and protection, but they kind of overfunction to the point of distress.
Yeah.
We all think about, right, like I need to plan for, is my front door locked?
Right.
Or not? Is my garage door down or not?
Yeah.
But, to prevent home intrusion. But we don't have the same distressing intensity of anxiety as someone who's experienced that home intrusion and physical assault, or has an experience of being deployed, for instance, or being on a call. I mean, I think we've got a lot of folks that are first responders right now whose stress levels are off the chart because the work they're being asked to do in the midst of this pandemic.
Yeah.
And there's just kind of been this overall, I've been calling it amplification, right?
Yeah.
Like you're not gonna see that published anywhere. It's kind of a Bowmanism. I just make up stuff all the time. But in the clients that I'm working with who have anxiety, and those who don't, there's just kind of this overall amplification of whatever distress is there in systems right now, in an individual, in families, in churches, in business. We're just seeing this intense amplification and kind of with the amplification, a clarification of what are the points of pain. What are the points of distress? That's certainly true, I think, for our first responders who are doing an amazing job of being on the front lines, securing communities, keeping us safe, keeping things orderly. Kind of where my heart breaks a bit, and I see this kind of tsunami coming. I don't watch much news, but I really try and stay attuned to what's happening in hospitals, not because I'm worried about is it going to be here? It's going to be everywhere eventually. But as I see these interviews with physicians or med techs or nurses, and I read, either watch the interview or I read, so many early indicators of trauma and post-traumatic distress that is going to take a while to show up for these first responders, these folks literally on the front lines, and nobody's talking about it.
Yeah.
Right, like I've seen all these interviews, but I haven't seen someone address the reality of these early indicators of PTSD, especially in New York, kind of a primary epicenter right now.
Absolutely.
The look on the faces, the words they're using, these hallmark characteristics that we see of PTSD are already there for these folks on the front line. And I think we've got to make sure that once the pandemic is done, once kind of things get back to life as typical. I don't say life is normal anymore. Life as typical, because we're gonna have a new typical. That we've got to make sure that we're doing justice to these folks, first responders, physicians, nurses, anesthesiologists, anybody that's been there in the trenches, so to speak, working face to face with patients who are suffering, dying from this disease, that we don't leave them behind. And similarly, kind of one of my predictions is we've got to keep kids moving right now. Kind of school, I know, has been interrupted here in Kansas. Many states have canceled, and we've kind of transitioned to online learning environments, which is an important part of their cognitive development, their academic development. But one of the things I don't believe that we're talking enough about yet, and I hope that we will eventually culturally, is the trauma to kids when so much of their life really happens in a schooling environment. Right. And even if you're homeschooling kids, right? Good. there's still interruption, there's still intrusion to the ebb and flow of their lives. If the activities that they go to as a part of their socialization, the co-ops can't meet because kids are really carrying the virus differently, which is fascinating. Like, that's a whole rabbit trail we could pursue scientifically. We just don't know yet why kids' bodies aren't getting infected or aren't carrying the symptoms if they are infected in the same way. But there's an interesting parallel for me. I think our kids are carrying the anxiety and trauma of this in a different way. And it's probably going to take until school starts in the fall for there to be an opportunity that's familiar enough to them for a lot of the intensity of the stress and any trauma they're carrying as a result of this to finally show up. So I'm looking at September from a mental health perspective.
Oh my God.
I'm looking at August, September as kind of these spaces where there's the ride up the escalator, the ride up the what you want to call it, a Ferris wheel, if you want to call it a roller coaster. Like, we're still on the way up. But when the ride's done, whenever that is, like, there's going to be some lag time between the end of the ride and when that distress really manifests itself for first responders, folks on the front lines, but also for kids. And we've got to be thinking about how can we help them move. And it gets back to some of Peter Levine's work where he talks about movement is this primary mechanism we have for processing trauma. Now, if we get into the Latin root for emotion, emate, to move, becomes really interesting. That anxiety, I called anxiety a master emotion, probably the master emotion neurobiologically earlier because of the amygdala that we have. These centers that are designated specifically to appraise threat, determine fear, and then move us reflexively into responses that are going to keep us safe. We have, again, as a master emotion, it really determines so much of how we keep ourselves safe. But movement in Peter Levine's work, this idea of movement in response to distress, and to include intense distress like traumatizing moments, really it's a movement that helps our bodies continue to process the intense emotions that we're feeling. Meaning, emate, to move, we're designed to move toward connection. We just talked about that from a biblical perspective. But I think the reason we see so many people out walking and running and hiking, to the point sometimes of violating the shelter-in-place orders or the 6-foot distance. I saw a picture today of a state park in Georgia, and it's jam-packed with people. Right? Like, they're instinctively moving because that's how their bodies are helping their minds process the intensity of the current circumstances, but like moving into spaces that increase the probability of getting infected or transmitting an infection. Right? But so it's interesting to see what this is revealing about God's design for the human body and how we process emotions in the midst of this pandemic. But I think for our kids in particular, we've got to be thinking about them moving. I see a lot of adults out running. I see a lot of adults out exercising. You know, kids in particular, if they've got no school and get their now schoolwork on a screen done quickly, like, the primary temptation is going to be indulgence on movies, indulgence on television, indulgence on video games. You know, some of that's just going to happen, and we need to think about good enough parenting. Like, your kid's going to watch more TV right now in the midst of this than they would have otherwise, because their social avenues are shut down. You can backfill some of that space with games and puzzles and going on walks, and those are all, do those things. Parents need to be doing those things. And we need to create some grace. Like, kids are just going to watch things or play things a bit more. Because if we're honest, Patrick, most of us, if we looked at our screen time calculations and we looked at how much we're on Facebook or on Instagram or on Twitter trying to consume information, like, they're just a reflection of what they're seeing us do. And we try and control their lives and their behaviors in a way to kind of de-escalate our own anxiety. But if we're honest with ourselves and look at our own kind of screen time stats, we're doing as much, maybe more, than they are. And they're just taking our lead. So I think when it comes to how families can help navigate the impact of this crisis in the system, both for parents, but especially for kids, movement is such a critical part. Movement around the house, movement outside of the house in safe ways, go on a walk with the family, but maintain those 6-foot social distancing boundaries. But Peter Levine's work, as simple as it may be, right? Like, movement is a way our bodies process emotion, right? Duh, Todd. Like, there's a reason I jump up when the Chiefs secure the interception to win the Super Bowl. Patrick, I looked like an idiot. I think my wife recorded it, actually. I hope that she never posted anywhere. I jumped up off the couch. I sprinted through the front door. I ran out and screamed. And you know what? There was a bunch of other dads outside screaming at the top of their lungs.
Yeah.
Right? My kids are. Everybody wants to see that video now. Maybe we'll do that as like an extra, right? Like,
yeah, both.
Click here to subscribe. You get access to Todd Bowman going crazy when the Chiefs win the Super Bowl video. We know we do this, but I think it's really important for us to do it intentionally in this time and space. And I think so much of when we see Scripture and read Scripture, like be anxious for nothing, but in everything through prayer and petition, present your requests to the Lord. There's a spiritual reality to that, but there's movement in that prayer and petition on a spiritual level, on a theological. Like we move ourselves into audience with the Lord to pray and petition. And I think we have to do that in a physical reality too, in a physical sense as well. We need to be moving. So spiritually and physically, I think there's a lot more symmetry than we recognize. And if we can just leave behind, and we started with this, the rebuke of the fear not,
right,
and kind of focus on the movement part of prayer and petition spiritually, service to others as a way of loving and caring for our neighbors in ways that obviously honor the 6-foot social distancing guidelines. But physically too, getting our bodies to move is a way that we prevent a lot of these big emotions of anxiety, of obsessive thinking, of traumatic re-experiencing. Movement is going to help all of us do two things. One, keep those intense emotions from taking root. But two, if you're someone that's struggling with anxiety of any level, any caliber, like we're going to prevent the escalation or intensification of that by way of movement.
Yeah. I want to invite you to one of our Red Ink Revival leadership retreats. Retreats are 40-hour plus intensive experiences led by psychotherapists, neuroscientists, and tenured pastors. These amazing intensives help pastors, staff, and marketplace leaders lead wholeheartedly in every sphere of life. Our retreats are profoundly helpful to you as you lead your organization. However, the most important person you will ever lead is you. Pastors and marketplace leaders struggle with the same emotional drivers. Statistics show that 70% of pastors struggle with depression and fear of inadequacy. 77% feel they do not have a good marriage. 90% are workaholics. 64% are engaged in secret activity around alcohol, drugs, and sexual behaviors. 84% wish they had a processed friendship that they could confide in, but grieve the fact that they don't have such a person. Today's leaders are painfully struggling with depression, isolation, anxiety, and panic attacks, and then powerlessly ruminating over what coulda, shoulda, woulda been. Then to right the ship, leaders tend to chase the illusion that a greater performance and a greater success will quiet the enemy in their souls. But performance, even if gained, measured, and celebrated, never quiets the soul. These ruminating emotional states gain momentum over days, months, and years and give power to unmanageable behaviors like rage in marriage, avoidance as parents, or addictions like alcoholism, recreational drugs, pornography, or sexually acting out. For the spiritual leader, succumbing to one or more of these throws them into a firestorm of shame that ultimately keeps them in a cycle of bondage. Yet neurobiologically, we have learned that inordinate behavior is never about the ability to white-knuckle discipline through the temptation. The behavior is driven by emotional griefs, losses, and relationship injuries from our backstories. These emotional memories become embedded into our brain's neurocircuits. Until these memories are addressed and appropriately reprocessed, the struggler will continue to grow in the struggle until there comes the day of public discovery and painful disclosure. Red Ink Retreats provide hands-on experiences in concepts, techniques, and coaching derived from theology, brain research, and psychological modalities. Our goal is to improve your individual leadership satisfaction, releasing a freedom for an energized life and a surprising greater performance. Go to redinkrevival.com and click the Retreats tab. You'll be inspired by previous retreat attenders, you'll hear their stories, and then you can dream of what could happen if you attended a retreat yourself. It might bring exponentially more fruitfulness to your organization. It might save your ministry, your marriage, your kids, and maybe even your self-respect. What is the value of leading wholeheartedly? So what are you waiting for? Go and register for our next retreat. Thank you for letting me share our Red Ink Retreats dream. You know, it seems to me that you've got folks who can identify with the healthy, functional side of anxiety. But then you have the different categories of people who are managing the anxiety in a season like this. You've got people who do have PTSD. They have a traumatic profile that now has resurrected, and there's all these disorders that are playing out. You also have the other swing, the other extreme, if you will, of people who are still perhaps living in denial because it is such a covert anxiety. You're talking about all the kids and what they're experiencing in the overt sense of, you know, they've been disrupted in their schedules and right on down the line. But the global anxiety, the anxiety that's on the news, the anxiety about what has changed and made the disruption has now then become embodied in parents, and they don't even know it. And often I will even go so far to say that we are unattuned and maybe even in denial that we are experiencing a level of anxiety that's driving us, and our kids are absorbing whatever emotional states we're in, and we think we're protecting them, and certainly we want to protect them, and certainly there's a lot of techniques and tools. But if we're looking at the news and we're thinking about the stock market, and we're looking at our retirement packages, and we're looking at what does this mean for the future of my company, my business, my job?
Absolutely.
What's this mean? If we're absorbing that, it's just like the virus itself that's invisible. It actually can go to someone else in anxiety, a child as an example. So let's talk just a minute about how, and I'm thinking about the people that watch and tune in to this podcast. We have a lot of pastors that are, you know, looking for the content of how to best practice towards leading their congregations. But I know as a pastor, as I interview people in our congregation, for the most part, people in our congregation would report, I'm pretty chill. I don't really have any anxiety. I'm good. It's just, I'm ready for this to be over. And they report that, you know, again, I feel like I'm at peace. Well, my concern about that is that maybe there's more going on there than any of us are willing at this point to admit. And I'm not trying to create something that's not there, but in my experience, so, you know, I talk to people as you do around addiction, and it's interesting how somebody can be in the throes of an addiction and they say, well, I don't really have any anxiety. And it's like, well, an addiction has an anxiety disorder. It is an intimacy disorder. And so we know that there is the presence of that. Sometimes people are in conversations, they'll say stuff like, you know, I don't have any anxiety. And 30 seconds later, there will be an elevated spike of energy about something that is disproportionate to what it should be. And they will, you know, sometimes it's as simple as, I hate talking about emotions. And of course, in my mind, I don't judge them, but in my mind, I'm wondering, what is that? What's below the surface that's making you shut down, armor up, angry about the fact that there's even so much talk right now around emotions? Or again, somebody who is spiking up around like all the people taking the toilet paper, or just the craziness of standing in line and somebody not observing the 6-foot rule as we're getting ready to check out. If there is a spike of energy, that should indicate that there's more going on below the surface. So let's talk about this idea of denial of anxiety and how to help people begin to see that there's more going on, because you can't tame what you don't name.
Yeah, that's right.
So let's kind of hit on some of that.
Yeah, I think a starting point, just to validate what you said earlier, Patrick, anxiety is undoubtedly contagious.
Yeah.
Right, undoubtedly.
Yeah.
It is an energy, and we pick it up. And I think what's interesting is if we're not aware of that or not intentional about recognizing how our anxiety is impacting us, we're absolutely going to be transmitting. It's going to be picked up. It's going to be caught by those, especially in the family system, especially kids who don't have the same tools for understanding or navigating the intensity of the experience. Like as grown people with a fully developed orbital frontal cortex and prefrontal cortex, we might.
Right.
Doesn't mean we do. We might. Right? My best moments, I probably don't.
Yeah, right.
It's fully developed,
Absolutely.
but it's not functioning, which we can kind of get to if we want to talk about the physiology of anxiety and why those spikes of energy, those spikes of emotion might happen. But I want to hit the denial piece first. The denial sometimes is overt. Sometimes it's people who are actively in a space of saying like, nope, not going to feel this, going to put my head in the sand, I refuse. I'm checking out, wake me up when this is over, which makes sense. It's a survival mechanism, right? Like it's maybe akin to the freeze response. We talk a lot about fight and flight, right? But like we also have freeze response as well. And maybe denial is sometimes just to like, I'm gonna see through my rose-colored glasses and pretend that everything's gonna be fine. Sometimes it's not intentional.
Yeah.
Sometimes I think the denial that we see, or what we would see and appraise as denial in someone, really is a numbness. Maybe it's a fullness of emotion, and there's so much there that they've gotten numb to it.
Yeah.
And it looks on the outside, I'm doing fine, right? Like I'm at peace, like things are good.
Yeah.
It's kind of like when you get hurt, right? Like there's a lot of intense pain, but eventually your body does what it's supposed to do with endorphins, and the pain goes away, even though your finger's still broken.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? And it's not going to hurt again until it gets bumped.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And I think that's part of what we're talking about is, sometimes denial is just the intensity of emotion to the point of numbness that goes unrecognized until it gets bumped.
Yeah.
Sometimes the bump is, right, like what's happening with work or with finances. Sometimes the bump is someone asks you how you're feeling.
Yeah.
And now I'm aware of what I'm feeling, even though I need to stay in this place of numbness to stay, right, grounded, to stay level.
Yeah. Yeah.
But like that's not how emotion works.
Yeah.
Right? Like as soon as we're asked how we're doing, right? Like there's this sliver of opportunity for emotion to be felt.
Yeah.
Right? We try and package it back down to stay in that state of numbness, to not have to deal with things, but then it leaks out sideways.
Yeah. It'll come out.
Right? Screaming at the kids, right? Yelling at the neighbor.
Yeah.
However,
yelling at the news people, the media,
however
the
it comes out, it comes out sideways, right? And to me, that's a pretty good indicator that we're dealing with someone whose denial is really a numbness, a lack of attunement to the reality of their emotional state, than a more willful, volitional sense of like, I'm just going to choose to pretend that this isn't happening.
And we're not labeling them to judge them. We're simply wanting to identify that there is something that's there. And reality is, you and I both would agree that times like this make me so awakened to gratitude for what God has made himself known to me in, that my relationship with Christ has grounded me in ways that I don't suffer like other people that sometimes I witness suffer.
Yeah.
And sometimes we can know that and have an intense gratitude and yet never really check the boxes of what is happening on the inside. I know for me, I have to process through. I go to the grocery store and I think, okay, this is where the virus is, so how am I going to make sense of this in my world? How am I going to apply that to my faith in Christ? How am I going to walk these things out? I have to process that. I also think of the stock market. When it dropped 30% and I'm 55 years old, I'm very aware of that.
Yeah.
And then, the bounce backs, what's going to happen? Are we being too romantic with that it's all going to bounce back when you've got this level of jobs laid off and all for just to jump start us back? I'm aware of that. And so then I have to process that. I think what you and I are wanting to drive towards in helping people, helping pastors, organizational leaders, business executives, and so on, is we want to help people realize that when folks are in anxiety, they often don't present the overt kinds of symptoms, and yet it's still there. And what we're suggesting is can we help people just see where they're really at, have a healthy diagnosis so that they can begin to tame it with God's love, with the love of community, et cetera, right down the line. And so I think that what we're dealing with is critical. So you had mentioned a minute ago about how physiologically, neurobiologically, we've got the different parts of the brain. Let's talk through the brain, and if you want to, let's go into the vagus nerve, and let's talk all that through.
Sure. Yeah, I've already been thinking about that. So, when I think about the brain, kind of an oversimplification of the brain, when you think about the tripart brain, the brain stem, the limbic system, and the cortex, the frontal cortex and the neocortex. And thinking about, my mind goes to like random principles like cephalocaudal development, which basically just says that our brain stem and our central nervous system develops from the inside out. Right, so this idea of development is that the important stuff develops first, and then from there we go out. It's the reason our hands get cold when we're nervous, because blood is being forced into our major muscle groups, into our organs, so that we can flee or fight.
Yeah.
Like it's kind of really simplistic, but incredibly sophisticated survival mechanisms, right? Like, I don't need to worry about, like, I'm not a pianist, but or a guitarist, but I wouldn't, right now in this moment, sitting here on stage talking about anxiety, like I'm feeling the anxiety, like I wouldn't be able to perform well because my hands are cold, they're not getting adequate blood flow. Like my body is just having a stress response that's toward the end of like, okay, we're nervous. This is what we do when we're nervous. Incredibly sophisticated, but incredibly simplistic, and we've all experienced it. And I think to your point a second ago, we're all experiencing some level of anxiety in the midst of this.
Yes.
Be it the fear of infection because of the jobs that we're working in, or because the space we have to traffic to get the goods and resources necessary for life to keep going, food and groceries, and or worry about what is this going to mean. And sometimes, right, like to the point of numbness where we're experiencing it, but we don't recognize we're experiencing it. And I think why the neurobiology and why the physiology of anxiety is so important is because that becomes a really fantastic check-in point for us. As far as, okay, what is my body experiencing? And is it experiencing something that's giving me a pretty good indicator of the level of anxiety that I'm feeling? It could be, I've got a headache. Okay, if you've got a headache, is your blood pressure up?
Right.
Why is your blood pressure up? You've been walking, you've been exercising, you've been eating okay at home. Like, why is your blood pressure? Because it's a response to uncertainty and anxiety. Right? Maybe chest is tight, maybe insomnia is showing up, maybe, right? We haven't even talked about
stress in your shoulders.
Stress in the shoulders and neck. Yeah, absolutely. Like, so our bodies are really intricately connected. And when there's a threat appraised or a threat that's actually legitimate in our presence and experience, like they collaborate and harmonize really quickly, right? Like meaning, our endocrine system and our neurobiology and our musculoskeletal system and our pulmonary system and our cardiovascular, like all these intricate systems that are to me, just like incredible systems in and of themselves, like all of a sudden communicate and collaborate in a fascinating way, which speaks to the robustness and beauty of God's design for human physiology, that all the parts of the body come together. Kind of reminds me an awful lot of what Paul writes about in his epistles, right? This idea of integration of the body. He's talking about it socially, but he might as well be talking about the integration of the parts of the brain, or the integration between the mind and the body as we're trying to navigate these unprecedented times. I think what happens, I know what happens. The most simple way to describe what happens is just like with our hands getting cold, our feet getting cold, the blood being forced into our major muscle groups and into our organs to fight or flee. Same thing happens neurophysiologically.
Yeah.
Right? Like it's the same principle of the things that develop last are the first things to go offline. Sometimes that's the way corporations work. The last person to get hired is the first person laid off.
Yeah.
Same thing happens in our physiology.
Wow.
The last thing to develop, the thing that is least necessary in the present moment, is the thing that goes offline. Like I don't need to worry about like whether or not I'm going to learn to play the guitar or piano right now. I have enough time at home to learn how to play the guitar or piano.
Yeah.
Right. But if I'm in a state of stress that is forcing my major muscle groups to retain blood and my fine muscle motor experiences aren't getting nourished, like I'm not going to learn those skills because they're not important, quite frankly, right now. Neurophysiologically, what does that look like? I think it explains those spikes that you mentioned earlier, those intense expressions of affect where typically our orbital frontal cortex, our relational brain, our self-aware brain, our self-regulatory brain in the orbital frontal cortex, this brain that is really about like governing connection and movement and relationship and attunement to others and nurturing and caretaking for others. Obviously, right, like this idea of blood being pulled from the extremities to where it's needed in the brain stem.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like it's needed in the limbic system because we're processing really intense emotion right now. And we've all experienced it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? Like, so just a word of grace for everybody. Like in some way, if you reflected on the last 72 hours, in some way your behavior's not been what you wanted it to be. Like with lashing out in anger, with having an irrational thought of the future, with noticing some panic. We didn't even talk about panic disorder earlier. And there's very much a spirit of panic in the air. I felt it as soon as I got off the airplane at Dallas, Fort Worth, going through customs, getting our luggage, going through security again, waiting in, like there was an oppressive spirit of panic in the air. And you know me well enough to know I'm not looking for demons under every rock
absolutely.
But there was a spirit of panic, a contagious dimension of panic in the air. So we've all felt it, and we're all in process with navigating this. And I think that's why this conversation is so important. We're not just trying to identify things, we're trying to identify things to help folks more accurately orient to their experience of everything going on so that they can have more tools to really fundamentally navigate the present moment and the present crisis. Prayer and petition being an important part of that. Like our spiritual disciplines are a critical part of that, and yet like our bodies need to be focused on as well. So, and again, I think there's intersection between what we're doing spiritually and how we're using our bodies, where there's more overlap than we realize. So I think a piece of that is, I don't know, I think about things, surprise, surprise, like I think about random passages of scripture. Like I don't always go to the like tried and true. I'm thinking like, wow, it's interesting that so much of Deuteronomy 6 is about like mindful awareness. Like how do we carry these principles of God's truth with us? Right? Sometimes we carry them in embodied ways. So thinking about like mindfulness, reflecting on scripture, right? Being mindfully aware of what am I thinking right now? What am I feeling right now? What points of connection do I have? So kind of trying to get ourselves out of just this reflexive state of panic, reflexive state of anxiety, reflexive state of worry, by doing what we know moves blood back into our neocortex, doing things that involve connection. So even if it's digitally, even if it's on the phone, right? Like doing the things that we know help us share the load. Right? And I think one thing that pastors can be doing, you asked this question a bit ago, what can pastors be doing to help their people navigate this? Right? It's not just those probing questions of trying to help folks assess, okay, like I'm fine, I'm perfectly at peace with this. Like me and JC, we got this thing, man. Like we're good to go. We're just gonna ride this out. Okay, like that might be true for some people, right? Like that just in their temperament and their makeup. If you're an Enneagram person, and your Enneagram style, like maybe that is your wiring and your makeup, and bless you. We need those people of the community around us like to maintain equilibrium right now. So we can look around and go, okay, like I see somebody who's not freaking out.
Well, see,
I can take a deep breath.
I'm that guy, except there are these unique spikes. And then I return to that guy. So I'm that guy with spikes in return. And so when people are around me, they assume I'm just that guy. And what I'm wanting to do is make sure there's a level of honesty.
Yeah.
So, because that's where we as humans live.
Yeah.
Nobody is not, even Jesus at the tomb of Lazarus had to have a physiological expression.
Yeah,
he had
right.
to have a release,
That's
and
right.
he wept. He didn't weep because it was robotic.
No.
He wept because his body was containing this intensity that now he needed to release.
Yeah. Now you want to go there? Let's get into Jesus' physiological responses, even in the Garden of Gethsemane, where we see hematidrosis, this idea of his body to the point of distress, that an enzyme is produced where our sweat involves droplets of blood, and there's this rust-colored tinge. Because of the intensity of stress and anxiety that's being carried in the moment.
And yet he never sinned. He never stepped out of faith, because anything that's not of faith is sin. So he never got out of faith.
And it gets us back to where we started with. Anxiety is a natural byproduct of God's design for the human experience. And I think what qualifies as, like, when do we cross that threshold into sinful thinking?
Yeah.
Right? It's how we navigate this. I mean, think about it. In your anger, do not sin.
Yeah.
Validates the idea that we're going to get angry, and there's a way to navigate it so that we don't cross that threshold into sin. In our theology, we don't talk well enough about how do we navigate anxiety in that same way.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think that's part of where we have to invite listeners into this space of imagining, maybe my anxiety is not antithetical to my faith.
Yeah.
Maybe my anxiety is a response to the reality that's around me, and it's an invitation to me to think about, how am I going to invite my faith to speak to my physical reality in a different way?
Yes. Yeah, because what happens is when we are feeling anxious or even worried, when we're feeling that, and then we hear the rebuke, fear nots, and we think that it's a disorder to even have the anxiety or worry narrative that's showing up in our minds and in our bodies. When we are looking at that as it's wrong, the self-judgment that gets on that actually spins the neurochemicals from our amygdala that ends up causing that loop to get tighter and tighter. And so you get into more anxiety by judging yourself for being in anxiety. So what we have to do, even when you talk about spending time with God, mindfulness, meditating Scripture, etc., the huge caveat of that is that we have to be able to do that with no self-judgment, no judgment from God, because as soon as you feel corrected by God as you're sitting there and your mind wanders, and when it wanders, you're like, idiot, I can't believe you won't be able to sit here before God. You're such a failure. If you're doing that, you're actually increasing the cortisol. You are creating a further stress moment. But if you can say...
And you just awaken to the shame narrative.
Yes.
Right? I mean,
you're not enough.
What we talked about earlier, like in that internal appraisal, we just awaken the shame narrative, and that's how anxiety serves as this foundation out of which shame emerges. Yeah, because I'm deficient. Like I'm not doing, my prayers aren't enough.
Yeah.
So I'm not enough.
Because somehow,
or God's not enough, but we don't believe God's not enough, so it has to be me.
It has to be me. And if I'm messing up, if I'm failing, it's because the standard of God is perfection, which the Bible never tells us that, ever. We're told to grow. We are encouraged about how that in the journey, when we see anxiety or anger, we don't judge ourselves for it. We just lean into, because the answer to be able to calm all those circuits is really what comes down to in the brain of gratitude, empathy, compassion. And as you called it, it's all around the connected networks, or the networks of your brain around personality connection, interpersonal connections. That when you have those with empathy, compassion, and gratitude, it calms all the circuits of the amygdala and makes you now then feel seen and heard and known. And so the issue isn't anxiety, the issue is repressing it. Or throwing yourself in the midst of it and not allowing yourself to be seen by God or yourself. Because a lot of times we believe we're seen by God, but we really have contempt to ourselves. We think we suck. We are idiots. We're stupid. It's that shame narrative. And then we bring that into the other relationships. Why would I want to talk to somebody else if I can't stand me? If I don't like me, why would I want to spend time with you? Yeah. Because you're just going to affirm it.
And isn't it so interesting, Patrick, that if we change the language just a touch, if we don't label our experience as anxiety that carries with it so much theological backstory.
Yeah.
And we call it suffering, because we're all suffering right now.
That's good.
It seems like Romans 5 all of a sudden avails to us this reality of growth over time.
Yeah.
Right? Suffering produces active tense, meaning that there's growth yet to occur.
Yeah.
Right? Like so that whole progression in Romans 5 of perseverance and character and hope is being formed and developed and grown in active tense.
Yeah.
But I think you're right. Like so much of where we get stymied is if we believe that we have to do this perfectly.
Yeah.
Right, and have to have already arrived, and like that somehow this whole dynamic is like God wanting to see how legitimate our faith is by how we orient Him in the midst of, guess what? Like we've all already failed in that regard. Because if we're being honest with ourselves, in the last 72 hours, we've had some space, not even crossing the threshold into sinfulness, but some space where we've not met the mark for how we've managed our anxiety or our anger or our despair or our fear or our depression which is okay.
Yeah.
Because when we look at that idea of suffering, like it's okay if we would just lean in to the suffering and surrender to the suffering that we're all feeling in this space. Yeah. Like I think we can hold our anxiety and our worry and our fear a bit more loosely.
Yeah.
And in that way, we can invite Jesus to do the work that He promises to do in our suffering, which is to produce perseverance and to produce character and to produce hope. And our hope doesn't disappoint.
Come on, which is about being able to see a future. Hope is all about positive imagination, a preferred idea, a prevailing in the end kind of mindset. And it's interesting because, and this is so important because I think we have a lot of people who are assuming this whole global crisis is just going to be a chapter that you turn from one page to the next and it's over. And that is not reality. Yeah. And so the longer this thing goes, the more a person's going to be triggered in their anxiety around futility, that no matter what I do, it doesn't matter. Yeah. And so it's healthy right now to begin to be aware of that and begin to process towards what drives you to feel as though anything you do is not going to be good or enough. And love yourself in that space with the empathy and compassion. Find gratitude that God has blessed you as He has. Right now, to me, a huge headline news thing ought to be, you cannot have a loss without God having blessed you first. So you have a point in loss to revert back to gratitude to say, God, you did it for me the first time, and I just want to live in that space that you did. And right now, I'm feeling so aware of how good I had it. The things that were normal and boring for me yesterday now are extraordinary. And so we return in gratitude. And physiologically, it does move us into a space of peace that passes all understanding. Right. And when he says in that text of Philippians 4:6, be anxious for nothing, he immediately says, but make sure you have thanksgiving with your prayer request. Isn't that interesting? He starts with anxiety, don't be anxious, and then he says, move to gratitude because of what it does in your brain, and then move to a request, which is how God empathizes with you, where you can feel His heart and soul to you. And then right after that, he says, and the peace of God that passes all understanding will keep and guard your heart and soul in Christ. So I just want to kind of wrap this up with what would be physiologically, what would be, let's kind of give handles to what can people do to mitigate or manage or process into the anxiety rather than run from the anxiety. What can we do to be able to come? We've given some ideas, but if you can kind of speak to it and put a bow on it.
Yeah, sure. I mentioned the body earlier, so really kind of tuning in and recognizing what's happening in my body. What, are my hands cold? Is my chest tight? And then thinking about how do I use breath, the ruach, the spirit, the breath of God that starts in Adam at creation. Like, how do we really slow down,
Yeah.
And like think about breath, and in that kind of breathing in a prayer of gratitude and breathing out a prayer of petition, maybe even of just like, again, using polyvagal theory, like how do I still my body and slow it down, right? While kind of just walking through and recognizing, okay, if my shoulders are tight, like how do I just breathe out and relax my shoulders? If my legs are tight, how do I just breathe out some of that stress and just do these kind of really simplistic and simultaneously very sophisticated stress reduction things that God imbued our bodies with as a way to navigate crisis.
Let me jump in on that one, because when I first heard about deep breathing, it's like, oh my gosh, really? That is so Eastern religion, yoga, and I'm not opposed to yoga, but the idea of that's just bizarre psycho voodoo. And yet what captures me around it is the neuroscience, that when you do deep breathing, what it does in the brain to actually bring you back to a calm state, the neurochemicals that are released, it's like, okay, you got me, let's deep breathe. So, yes.
Yeah. And what we don't think about is, for most Christians, when we gather together and worship and we're singing, like our bodies are having the same experience.
That's awesome.
So like, again, when we shift the focus a bit or change the term from anxiety to suffering, when we shift the term from Eastern to medicinal or Eastern to neurophysiological, right? Like all this, I'm like, it's not some spooky thing that, like, it's just the way God, the author of life and the creator of the universe, like created our bodies. We can use that tool. I think another thing that is as simplistic and kind of gets the eye roll from most people is expressive writing. The expressive writing literature, James Pennebaker down at the University of Texas at Austin and a number of others have just blown the top off the idea of neurological integration, right brain, left brain, how our affective story gets translated into language is a great way for us to de-escalate the intensity. And expressive writing is a way to do that.
Journaling, is that in essence of journaling?
Essentially, journaling tends to be a bit more about like, Dear Diary, today was day 14 of quarantine. I finally got to go out of the house and I saw Patrick and did a podcast.
So it's like a commentator.
It's more factual.
Yeah.
So if folks are doing journaling, that's more about internal processing of their story.
Yeah.
Here's where I find my distress. I'm so concerned about my neighbors who are in their 80s. My mom had all these symptoms. Praise be to God. She wasn't diagnosed with COVID. It was just a typical influenza bug, which is bad enough, right? Like that we just start using language in our neural development and our neural structuring processing to our advantage, which means like we all have activation in our right brain with all these big intense emotions and fears and worries that we're carrying, but finding a way, kind of like exhaling with deep breath, finding a way to process, it gets back to movement that we talked about earlier, right? Forms of movement, using God's design for our bodies like breathing and expressive writing as points of movement that help us de-escalate so that we can be that point of stability, that point of emotional regulation for our kids, for spouses, for congregations, if you're a business leader, a marketplace leader, that we can really have that peace that passes all understanding, not because like mysteriously God just gave it to us because we prayed, but because we've been intentional about leaning into His design for us.
Huge.
And that becomes the gift. And then out of that becomes the blessing to others, that because we've been faithful in understanding how He created us and doing the things spiritually, physically, emotionally that leave us grounded and embodying that peace, then we can give that gift of regulation to the people that entrust themselves to our care, our employees, our congregations, our kids, our spouses, clients on my end, et cetera.
Yeah. So we've got mindfulness with a non-judgmental emphasis on empathy, compassion, and gratitude. You've got deep breathing. You've got, what'd you call it, creative story?
Expressive writing.
Expressive writing.
Yep.
Is there anything else that we could give people to say, you could engage this immediately?
I think anything toward that end, right? Like, so walking and talking, I think is a good one. Why? Because we have bilateral stimulation. If you're taking a right foot, left foot, right foot, left foot, like your brain is having to coordinate top down and horizontal integration. So all the parts are being activated, especially if we're talking about what are you noticing on the walk?
Yeah.
What are you grateful for? I mean, I think there's actually been a number of principles that we've highlighted in our time together today.
The whole thing,
that, in summary, like things that are really accessible to us. Another great one would be memorizing scripture, which I know sounds like, oh great, the Christians want us to memorize more scripture.
Right.
But the idea, it's so much more than just like factually memorizing something.
Yes.
To me, it gets all the way to attachment theory and internal working models. Like, how do we put into our minds the things and integrate them into our thoughts so that when those spikes of anxiety come, the first thing that's there is a promise from the Word that our spirit can activate and like, okay, right? Like, here we are. And yes, like, I can give myself some grace because I feel my anxiety escalating, I feel my anger escalating, and like, here comes a truth from the Word.
Yeah, that is absorbing God's heart and soul around that word. It's not even the factual idea of the word.
Absolutely. It's the relational reality of like, God is in me, and the thought in my mind draws me back to the reality of connection to Him.
Yeah.
Like, it doesn't, I don't have to stay stuck in my anger. I don't have to stay stuck in my anxiety or my despair or distress. Why? Because like,
so awesome.
We do communion in this way.
Yeah.
Why can't we take in Scripture in this way?
Yeah.
Like, we do communion as an embodied reminder of like literally taking Him in, His body and His blood that was shed for us.
Yeah, right.
Because of the cross. Why not?
Yeah.
Like, why not at least try that on a daily basis? Focus on one promise from Scripture. If it's about hope, if it's about peace, if it's about God's promise and provision. Like, to me, it hits so many more boxes than just the Christianese thing of I memorized. It's not about, to your point, the factual onboarding of more information.
Yes.
It's about the process of deepening relationship and experience of who God is in a very real way.
Which another part of that is declaring what God said. So making affirmations of His Word, declaring His Word, of course, is a part of that whole mindfulness. This book of the law shall not depart out of your mouth, but you'll meditate in it day and night. So it ought to be in your mouth. There's something when you vocalize that it triggers the brain circuits that create this neurobiological calming. But it's not just the task of declaration, it is the emotional presence in the declaration. That you have a God who said this about you, and now you are identifying emotionally with what He said. So again, it's not, God, I need you to take my anxiety. It's, God, you've given me the tools to be able to process through the anxiety, and now I'm going to activate that in connection. I think what we've talked about today is just so powerful. I think it's so good, and I just appreciate getting to collaborate and hear all the expertise and the science and, what goes on in the body and the theology, just bringing all of that to bear. As time goes on, we'll probably need to revisit some of this. Sure. I know one of the things that you and I are going to want to talk about is anxiety around money and how money is not just a thing that we do, but it is very much integrated into the depths of our neurobiology. And there's a reason why we manage money. There's a reason why we experience emotions around money the way we do. And that's going to be necessary because so many of our pastors and business leaders have people that they're guiding and leading who are suffering emotionally around money right now. And so I do want us to visit that soon. And I also want to, in another podcast, talk about futility a whole lot more. Because 70% of pastors already are living on the threshold of depression, feeling like they're not enough, that their self-esteem is lower than it was when they started. And all of that comes to, I've tried everything. I've listened to every podcast, and now in a global crisis, after having consultants and everything that they've tried, I know it's true of me. After everything you've tried, you have a global crisis, and then you're like, I got one more thing that I can't control.
Yeah.
So to be able to get tools around that, I think can be really helpful to all of us. Todd, thank you so much for, again, being a part of the Red Ink Revival, man.
As always, pleasure to be here. I love it and look forward to our future collaborations here on the Red Ink Revival podcast.
Thank you for joining us today. I want to encourage you that you are enough to lead through this unprecedented time. God's called you, He's anointed you. You have innovative solutions to bring to novel problems. The novel coronavirus ain't got nothing on you. I want you to know that greater is He that's in you than he that's in the world, and God's mind is coming alive in your thinking. I just encourage you, we're praying for you. We want you to know that if you're wondering what in the world do we do next, go to our website at redinkrevival.com. There you're going to find our resources, retreats, upcoming special events, and just a growing bank of content. Sign up for our free e-newsletter to stay abreast of all that's available. And I want to make sure to emphasize our retreats. Our retreats are these amazing opportunities to spend 40+ hours with other pastors. This is also for church staff and their spouses, as well as marketplace leaders. I hope everybody can make it to one of these life-changing events. We have psychologists, therapists present. It's just an amazing opportunity for life change and to know how to be equipped for future leading in the world of crisis. Go to redinkrevival.com, check it all out. Everything we're building is to resource you to be a wholehearted leader. I'd love for you to be a part of our tribe, and I can't wait till our next episode. I'm glad you were with us today. We'll see you next time.